Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Nick, and in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you one method for snapping and panning the camera to objects in your scene. So you can see here that the camera is focused on the little crystal cluster that I've created here, but as soon as my player character moves out of the sphere of influence, the camera reattaches to the player and follows him around. So you can do this pretty much to anything. You don't have to use like a top-down scene or anything like that. As long as you have an object, you should be able to use this technique for sort of snapping and panning the camera and moving it however you want. So let's take a look at how I did this. All right, let's take a look at how I've set up my scenes so far. I have a player scene, which is a kinematic body 2D, a sprite, our little adventure guy texture here, and a collision shape, which is a simple circle shape. Currently, the player is the only scene with a script attached, and it's really just the basic 8-way movement script that you can find in the Godot documentation, pretty much just copied and pasted. In our main scene here, this is the environment we're going to be moving around in. It's just a node 2D with a tile map, and you don't need a tile map. I'm just doing that so we have something a bit more interesting to look at. Next up, we have a sort of crystal cluster that I made, and this is what we're going to be sort of snapping and panning the camera to. And it's just a static body 2D with some simpler instance scenes that make up the sort of group, and basically I just arrange them, sort of rotate them, and add them wherever I want to make up my little crystal cluster here. Finally, it also has a collision shape. Alright, so let's use those elements to actually set up our scene here. First thing I want to do is add a Y sort to the scene, because I want my player to be able to move behind the crystal clusters. So to the Y sort, we're going to instance our other scenes here. So I'm going to add my player, put him right there, and we're going to add some crystal clusters. So I'm going to arrange these so that there's enough space between them, so that as we're moving around our scene, it'll be easier to see the camera actually sort of snapping to each one as we get close. So there we go. This is our basic scene setup. Now let's move on to actually adding a camera to the scene. And it's easier to sort of independently control the camera if it's a child of the main scene and not attached to the player. Because if the camera is, for example, always a child of the player, it's always going to move around when the player moves, and it's going to be a bit trickier to actually get it to sort of move independently. That's why I just want it as a child of the main sort of node at the top here and not a child of the player. So we got our camera, and I'm actually going to move the camera onto roughly where the player is. It doesn't have to be exact. And then I'm going to attach a script to my main scene over here. So I'm going to delete the stuff I don't need. One thing I want to do is make sure I have my variables created. So on ready var camera 2D. There we go. So I got my camera and I have my player. And I'll add my ready function just in case I need that. But the first thing we're going to do is make sure the camera is following the player. So we're going to add a process function with a delta. And then we're going to say camera.setPosition player.getPosition. And because it's in a process function, it's going to update every single frame, and then it will follow the player. So one thing we need to do is in our camera 2D node, we need to set it to current. Otherwise, it's not actually going to work. But once that's set to current, let's hit play. And as I move my character around, you can see the camera is following. So the next thing we want to do is find some way to recognize when the player has entered the sort of sphere of influence of the object that we want to snap the camera to. So basically, all that means is we're going to add another area 2D to our crystal cluster, or whatever object it is you want to snap the camera to. So under crystal cluster here, I'm going to add a child node, area 2D, and I'm actually going to call this camera capture, and then to that we'll add a collision shape. And we'll just use the circle shape, but I want to make it as big as it needs to be. And actually, let's move that up a little bit, center it on there. There we go. So now in our main scene, we have sort of 5 areas that will snap the camera. So in our crystal cluster, now we're going to add a script and handle the behavior of when the player enters that area. So I want to declare my variables. So we got our area 2D here. The way this is going to work is when the player enters the sphere of influence of the object, that area 2D is going to send a signal to the camera 2D in the main under the main node, and then that signal will cause the camera to snap to that position of wherever the signal came from. So under our crystal cluster here, we're going to declare a couple of custom signals. So we'll say capture and another signal release. So under our camera capture area 2D here, go to node signals, and we want to make sure there's a signal that gets sent. So when body entered, let me expand that a bit. When body enters, because we're using a kinematic body 2D for our player, we want to attach that signal to the crystal cluster script. We also want to do the same thing for body exited. There we go. So when the body enters, we want to emit our capture signal. So we'll say emit signal capture. When the body leaves, we want to emit signal release. So we're emitting signals, but how can we get the camera to listen to those signals if those signals are being emitted in scenes that are kind of separate from the scene that the camera is in? And to do that, we're going to be using groups and iterating through a list of groups, or a list of objects in the group. So back in our crystal cluster, under the main node of that scene, we're going to go to groups and create a group. We'll just say cluster and add that. Make sure to save it. So now when we go to our main scene, you can see the little group symbol is beside every single one of those crystals. And the way it's going to work is we're going to iterate over that group, find the one that just emitted the signal, and then that's how we'll snap our camera. So let's go back to our script here. In our main scene, under ready, in our main scene, we're going to connect the signal that we just created to the main scene, and we can then use that to control the camera. So we're going to say for, let's just say I in get tree, get nodes in group. We called our group cluster. I.connect, and this is the signal we want to connect. And there's 2 of them. We have capture as the first one, and we want to connect it to this script. So we'll say self, and then we want to trigger a function. So we don't have that function yet, but I'll just call it set camera. And I also want to do the same thing for the release signal. So there we go. And it's probably going to throw an error, or it might not, but we need to create these functions to actually tell the scene what to do once we receive these signals. So let's do that. We'll create our set camera function, and we'll create our release camera function. All right. So another thing we need to do is make sure that we can actually change the target that the camera is being pointed at. So currently it's being set manually to the player, but we want to make this a variable so that it can change dynamically. So I'm going to create another variable. Let's call it target and initialize it as null. And then under ready, we can say target equals player. So it actually has something to attach to in the beginning, and then we'll change the process function to make sure that it uses the variable and not a sort of static manually entered object. So there we go. Target player, let's test it out real quick. Okay, still working. So it is emitting the signal, but we just can't tell. So let's handle capturing the camera first. So when we get this signal, we want to trigger the set camera function, and all we have to do is change target. So under set camera, we'll say target equals, and this is where you might be wondering, okay, how do we actually know which of the crystal clusters is being targeted that's emitting the signal? And we actually have to go back to our crystal cluster scene here and add a parameter to the signal. To do that, all you do is add another variable or another value after a comma in the signal that gets emitted. And we're using self because we want to refer directly back to the crystal cluster itself at the level that the script is attached. So self refers to the static body 2D itself and whatever properties are associated with it. So that's how we can know which cluster to actually attach the camera to. So we'll save that, come back to main, and then in the function that we're calling, we can add the parameter. And we'll just, doesn't actually matter what you call it, we'll just say cluster, and then target equals cluster, because that is the self parameter that we passed. So it enters the function there and then reassigns target there. All right, so now it should work. So under the debug menu, I'm going to set visible collision shapes, so we can actually see when we enter and exit the sort of sphere of influence for the crystal. And oh, you know what I did? I set the target to that crystal, but you can sort of see how it's working. The camera will be fixed on the crystal while the player is next to it, but let's fix that. So in my crystal cluster, I think that's where it's happening. The area 2D is colliding with the static body 2D, which is itself a body that the node sort of emits a signal on. So we don't want that to happen. We basically want to remove a collision mask from the area 2D. So in other words, under collision for the area 2D, we want to remove the mask so that it doesn't collide with itself. And that way, our player will be the only thing that collides with that object. If I enter, there we go. So if I enter the sphere, it snaps the camera. And we haven't actually done anything else, so it's going to stay there. But let's handle releasing. And to do that, all we have to do is set the target equal to the player again. And now, whenever we enter a sphere of influence, it'll snap to the crystal. And as soon as we leave, it'll snap back to the player. So that's a little bit jarring, like it's snapping instantaneously. We can go to our camera 2D and turn on smoothing. And I like to keep it at 4. And we can also adjust the drag margin, which is basically just the amount of time you have to be walking before the camera will start following you. And I'll just set it to 0.1. All right, let's take a look. So now when we enter the sphere of influence, the camera moves to the object. We can move around, the camera stays there, and as soon as we leave, it returns to us. So there we go. This technique can be applied to pretty much any object. You just have to get and set the position of the camera. So there we go. That's how you do that. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.